John, we're sitting in front of Caravaggio's most famous painting, The Beheading of St. John the Baptist. When Caravaggio arrived in Malta, he was already a well-known artist, and in fact he was renowned for the realism that he brought to painting. Now, as curator of this oratory, I get a lot of time to spend here, and I often look at certain details in the painting. And although the figures are painted in a very realistic manner with his astounding chiaroscuro, I find that the setting is rather staged. There's a theatrical element which reminds me of the opening scene of a play. Is this theatrical element something that is recurring in his paintings?
The theatricality of the setting, they're on a stage and they're all in the front room, and they're all so perfectly positioned and poised, is the most in this painting of any painting by Caravaggio. As a result, there's more open space in this painting. As a result, probably that's one of the reasons it's his most famous, because he has learned or taught himself or discovered that the great areas of just subdued tone, mostly brownish, lend this contemplative air. And it's about the figures, what they're doing, but they're wrapped, their action in this great silence. Now, how he came to this effect isn't quite clear to us. In fact, it's possible that he's the inventor of a theatrical look in paintings, because yes, there's theater before him, but theater before him was mostly in the form of passion plays, annual plays that never changed, and the figures could move around. They weren't positioned in this timeless pose that he's come up with. And also, nearly everything we see in his realism was known to painters earlier than himself. The painters who influenced him were the Venetians like Titian and Tintoretto, and also Lombard painters. He put them all together. But finally, the reason your question is so valid is that in the last 15 years or so, there have been theatrical companies traveling the world, and they make tableaux vivants. That means a living painting of actors in the poses, especially of this painting, but also of the ones in Rome and the Contarelli Chapel, in which actors walk around, they make the action, and then they pause finally in the final position that he shows in his painting.
Now, by the time he painted this work in 1608, he was already a master of his brush.
Of course.
And I often get intrigued by the details, certain details in the painting. He loosely sketches in St. John's face and his feet and the prisoners, but then goes through great detail and painstaking detail almost when it comes to the keys, for instance.
Right, they're so striking.
And the dagger. And the old maid grasping her face in horror. And I often wonder, why did he do that? St. John's face is so important. Why did he give more importance to painterly details, to the keys? Is this symbolism? Is he using symbolism here? Or is it just one of his artistic tools?
Cynthia, you're only asking me for my opinion. You don't think I have had direct communication with Caravaggio?
Well, the painting is all we have.
And the great art historian Roberto Longhi used to say, it is the primary document. I think that these details, that the focus on those keys and other places, I think it's a technique in his realism, and sometimes they, of course, have symbolic value also. But I think it's a technique in his realism that it shouldn't come as a surprise, because he's from Lombardy, near Milan, Caravaggio, that's the name of the town he was born. And in the 1500s, the greatest artistic influence on the painting of that area was Leonardo da Vinci. And what you have in Leonardo very often is certain elements are idealized to the point of seeming softer, and then there are little pieces of still life that focus, and the effect is evocative of a dream.
So one should refrain from trying to read into the painting too much.
Oh, let's read all we want. It's that I don't have a reason for that man to have those three keys, because he is the jailer, and then we know that for sure. He has to also be sure we read the subject correctly. He so works without the conventional symbols. There are no angels flying in the sky. There's no cloudburst of light looking down to show us that this is the martyrdom of a saint. Instead,
yes,
it's shown.
That's unusual, isn't it?
Completely unusual. Mm-hmm. So he has to face the fact that it has to be clear and defensible that it shows the sacred event.
John, from the research that you carried out in Rome, it is very clear that he got into trouble with the law frequently, and his, we can say, delinquent character is something that we can't deny. And, this makes me think of why did he have this dark view of life and mankind that we see even in his early paintings, such as the card players and the gypsy fortune teller, that on first glance seem like innocent renditions of everyday life. But once you get closer, you find that the protagonists are actually being cheated.
Right.
And this takes me back to his upbringing between Caravaggio and Milan, which was at that time under the grip of the Catholic reformer Charles Borromeo, whose sermons at best were extremely punishing. And he would preach to the congregation to purge their sins through punishment. And I wonder how this would have fueled the imagination of this would-be great artist.
This restrictive climate in Milan under Carlo Borromeo would have made it a difficult place for him to get along, because he was always provocative, rebellious against authority, and there even is a considered reliable rumor written down by someone that he had already spent a year in prison in Milan before he came to Rome.
So it starts from a very young age.
He's actually born into comfortable circumstances. His father was a superintendent for the Marchese of Caravaggio, and so he had a chance for an education and even learned how to use a sword, which was a noble thing to do. But he came to Rome for the greater freedom. Rome being such a sprawling capital, it had a large central zone north of the Pantheon where all the taverns and bordellos were. And despite periodic attempts to send all the prostitutes and pickpockets away, it was impossible. There were too many of them. And so he's living in this zone and or near it, because he changed his residence a lot. Perhaps he changes his house so much in his early years because he's not a very good guest. At any rate, he's always doing provocative things. His painting of an altarpiece of the death of the Virgin was rejected because he showed Mary recumbent on the bed, surrounded by the weeping apostles, and he really only has symbolized her ascent into heaven by this extraordinary upward movement of a curtain. It was objected to the fact that he emphasized how dead she was.
But he lived in the household with the Cardinal Del Monte.
Right.
But he seemed to still be attracted to the back streets of Rome.
Well, the Cardinal Del Monte was the ambassador of the French, and he also worked for the Medici, and these are the most liberal political parties, if you will, in Rome. They contrasted against the Spanish, and they also were interested in the latest science, the thought that perhaps Caravaggio looked at projected images would make sense because the other great thinker that Cardinal Del Monte supported was Galileo.
Yes, he was also interested in alchemy, it seems.
Yes, that was considered cutting-edge chemistry. Wouldn't it be great if you could figure out how to make gold from rubbish?
And he walked around with a sword, and one intriguing aspect is how he would buy fine clothes and then wear them until they fall into rags. I mean, who does that?
I think this fits in with your observation that he was, and this was noted by, we have 2 or 3 eyewitness descriptions of him in these early years of how unkempt he was. And that is a form of rebellion, to not bother to shave or comb your hair and walk around in soiled clothes. That's what he did. Or he's looking for a fight.
Could be. We know that he kept the company of courtesans. And this brings me to how well do you think his memory served him? Because the old maid clutching her face is not exactly a new personality. And do you think that the maid bending over with the charger is Philidel? Would he have remembered her?
Well, I don't think he would have shown her as an old woman.
No, the young
The
maid.
younger one.
She had red hair, no?
We have a picture or 2. There's a lost portrait and so forth. And sometimes we think that she's St. Catherine in the painting that's in the Thyssen Museum in Madrid. Sometimes we think it's Philide and the Magdalene. One of the things about his realism is because he paints from models, and also he's provocative. This returns to your thought about the theatricality. His models seem to compose a group of actors because the same woman appears as St. Catherine one day as the maid, does resemble her a little, but it's some years later. But of course, as you know so well, they have great memories for images, artists do.
John, we have to talk about the signature, if we can call it a signature, because to me it seems like a more well-crafted graffiti than a signature. Whether it was spontaneous or something that he thought about will remain a mystery, I guess. But the fact that it has the prefix Fra shows that he wanted to affirm his position as a brother in this prestigious order.
Certainly.
But he does this in the blood gushing out from John's neck.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
Well, all we can do when we're trying to answer a question like that is look for analogies and other works. And going back to the Renaissance and even earlier to medieval art, that wasn't so far from him as it is from us. Flowing blood is the river of our salvation, so that they're not as shocked by the appearance of saintly blood as we might be. But to write your own name in it, of course, is Caravaggio's most fascinating aspect. He makes every picture that he makes somehow about his own life. And this is the reason that Caravaggio has come to be considered the first modern painter. Because unlike a painting of St. John by Titian, for example, who was a great Venetian artist before Caravaggio, we don't think that this reveals anything about Titian. We think every picture made by Caravaggio is revealing about him.
That is very true. So we're here in the Oratory where he painted this famous painting. This is where he was invested in the order, and this is unfortunately where he was defrocked and basically kicked out of the order.
We know for a fact that's poignantly true, of course. We know for a fact that when he fled punishment to Sicily, he continued to declare that he was a member of the order. It meant so much to him, and it was also such a good protection.
Yes, he was, and especially considering that he even had the protection of the Grand Master out of the Vignacourt, of which he painted that astounding portrait of his.
Right, magnificent. Among the tremendous masterpieces of art here in Malta.